All right, good morning, anatomy and physiology honor students. This is, of course, well, you know who this is, so we don't have to have any introduction. Hey, today, along with the review, I also want to go over, I told you you're going to have to know about endochondral ossification, bone formation. I want to talk to you about this a little bit to give you some insight to it, just to make sure that we're on the same page and we have you starting off in the right direction when it comes to being able to explain this to me. So, along with endochondral ossification, there's also intramembranous ossification that you'll need to be able to talk about. And obviously, you have to know what ossification is. Ossification is the process of basically it's a process by which bones form. It's how bones form. That's ossification, how bones form. And there's I want to say two basic types. You have the initial bone formation in an embryo and fetus, and that is the intramembranous ossification. Intermembranous, it's I-N-T-R-A, intra membranous, membranous, intermembranous ossification. And that is a quite complicated type of bone formation, and it's where the cartilage layers are like sheets. You find this typically, by the way, in the flat bones of the skull and the mandible. So the intramembranous ossification you'll find in the flat bones of the skull and the mandible. Now remember, this is not going to be test questions for the multiple choice. This is going to be for your essay short answer type question. So we're just going over this to help you along with that. The intramembranous, even though it's a bit complicated, it is the simpler of the two types, the other type being the endochondral. This is the simpler of the two methods. Of course, nothing is simple the way all this happens. It's really not simple at all, but of the two, it is the simpler of the two. The location, there's an ossification center. And this is the site where the bones develop. So you have the ossification center, and this is where the bones develop. This is where the bones develop, in the ossification center. So you want to make sure you know that. And what you'll also want to know is, in the development of this ossification center, you have this cluster called the mesenchyme cluster. The mesenchyme, M-E-S-E-N-C-H-Y-M-E, the mesenchyme cluster. This is where it originates. This is where the cells differentiate. First, they become osteogenic cells, and then and from there they turn into osteoblast. So they go from osteogenic cells to O-S-T-E-O, osteoblast. And you know that the blast are the builders of the bone. Blasts are the builders of bone. So you go from the osteogenic cells to the osteoblast. And these osteoblasts are what secrete the extracellular matrix of the bone. It excretes the extracellular matrix of the bone. And after that, the next step there is the calcification process. This is where the extracellular matrix actually stops. The production of matrix basically ends, and then we get the calcification. The calcification takes place next, and the calcification is how can I say this? The osteocyte. There's osteocytes, and these osteocytes, these are bone cells. These osteocytes are in the lacuna, and they extend throughout. Their little cytoplasmic processes that they have extend out in the canaliculi and radiate in basically every direction. Then, of course, there's more mineral salts, calcium salts, and different salts that develop and lay down. And then from there, we have the formation of the trabeculae. And remember, the trabeculae are the pattern. It's the spongy. It's what's producing the spongy bone in the center of that bone, or in the tips of those long bones. And that trabeculae, remember, it looks like that sponge lattice work. And then we have our veins and our arteries that run and form through there. And this is where the red and yellow bone marrow eventually form. From there, remember, we have that. Remember, we talked about we have that long bone, or basically any bone really. And we talked about on the end of that bone where there's going to be articulations, we have that hyaline cartilage called articular cartilage, and then around the bone itself there's that thin layer that's called the pericardium. I can't draw and talk at the same time. I'm going to stop right there, but you can see that would go around the entire bone. And that's the pericardium. That's the heart. Periosteum. See, I can't do two things at one time. That's the periosteum, that thin layer that is very sensitive to pain. That goes around the entire bone, except for I don't believe it goes. I don't remember I'm not 100% sure of this, but I'm thinking it does not go. Pretty sure it doesn't go where the articular cartilage is. I don't think it does. It might. I'm just not sure of that actually. Now, in the early stages of development, there is periosteum there, but I do think it goes away or gets covered up by the hyaline cartilage. Not 100% sure on that, so it won't be a test question. But after the formation of the trabeculae, then we do have the development of the periosteum. And that's that thin layer of compact bone replaces the surface layers of the spongy bone, but the spongy bone remains in the center. It remains in the center. Now, the replacement of bone or cartilage by bone, when the bone turns into bone from cartilage, that's the endochondral ossification. That is the endochondral ossification. That is when the cartilage turns into the bone. Now, this is a little more involved than the other type of ossification, which, as you remember, right, is intramembranous ossification. Now, the endochondral ossification is a little bit different. Most bones, I'll get a different color that I think it's easier to see. Most bones are produced or developed by endochondral ossification. Most bones are. Remember, it's the flat bones in the skull that are not, and the mandible, but most of the other bones in the body are developed this way. And so in that stage, we have the development of the cartilage, and this takes place at the site where the bone is going to form. The cells kind of all get together, clump together, and they develop into what's called chondroblast. These chondroblasts develop, and this is where the bone forms. And once again, the chondroblast, they secrete the extracellular matrix. Producing that cartilage model that's going to consist of the hyaline cartilage. And then we have this perichondrium that develops around the cartilage. And then the next stage is that growth of the cartilage. Once the chondroblasts are deep into the extracellular matrix, when they're way down there deep inside that tissue, then they are called chondrocytes. They go from being chondroblasts to being chondrocytes. Just like we had osteoblasts that are osteocytes, now we have chondroblasts that are chondrocytes. Okay, and in here is where we see an increase in the size. Things begin to calcify. The chondrocytes start to die, and when the chondrocytes die, this is where we get that the dense bone starts to build. And actually, and not only that, but the dying, just like in the other, also can lend to starting the lacunae and the small cavities that we're going to see in the compact bone. Then after that, then we have the development of the primary ossification center, and this ossification it proceeds inward from the external part of the bone, going inward, and this is where we have an artery, the artery that brings nutrients, not just blood, but the nutrients that go along with the blood. It goes through the periochondrium through the cartilage, and this stimulates the osteogenic cells. Now we're back to osteo, not chondro. Now we're getting osteogenic cells that differentiate into osteoblasts. Remember, the osteoblasts are the builders. They're the builders. All this is in your book, by the way, on, let's see, what page is it on? 128, 129, 30, 131, and ends on 132. But remember that the perichondrium, which is what is going to turn into the periosteum, and this chondrium, because it's more cartilaginous, so it's called chondrium, but it will turn into the periosteum once you get once you start having your primary ossification centers. Once that takes place, then the next stage is the development of the marrow cavity, or that medullary cavity in the center of a long bone. And so as the primary ossification center grows towards the end of the bone now, not just going internal, but extending to the superior and inferior aspects of the bone, osteoclasts break down some of the spongy bone trabeculae, and this is what leaves that cavity, the medullary cavity. And once again, this is in the diaphysis, right? So we have our bone, the medullary cavity. It's right in here. It's in the diaphysis. The diaphysis, remember, is the long portion of the bone. So just to make sure we're on the same page with that, you know where the medullary cavity is. Once again, this is where the red bone marrow is that ultimately turns yellow as we become older, turns into yellow bone marrow. And then lastly, well, not lastly, then we have the secondary ossification centers. And this is where the blood vessels enter the epiphysis, okay? The blood vessels enter the epiphysis, and then these secondary ossification centers develop. This usually happens around the time of birth. The time of birth is when this happens, to give you a timeline. And remember, a lot of these bones have to stay cartilaginous and soft because they have to get through this rather small canal, okay? We're trying to put a tomato through a straw, basically, is what we're talking about here. And if the straw and the tomato are both rigid, it ain't going to happen. But the straw has the ability to flex, and actually through our anatomy, our hormones are released that soften up our pubic symphysis, and other ligaments start to stretch in the pelvic girdle. And then, of course, the bones in this newborn that's coming into the world, they're soft, they're cartilaginous, so the head can give, because we have these very soft, membranous, cartilaginous, bony structures that have fontanelles that can shrink, and not shrink, but can allow the bone to compress together and move, and create all kinds of wonderful possibilities for the birthing process to take place. But then lastly, we have the formation of the articular cartilage at the epiphyseal plate. And of course, you remember that epiphyseal plate is that plate where once it sets in, then growth no longer takes place, and we've reached our final height for that particular individual. So this formation of articular cartilage, and remember, we said that the articular cartilage is this blue stuff right here that I'm now making pink. It's this articular cartilage, hyaline cartilage. It's at the end of the long bones where there is going to be a joint, a synovial joint usually. Um, and remember, it covers the epiphysis. It becomes the articular cartilage. And then we have this sometime from between childhood prior to adulthood, your book says, we get this epiphyseal growth plate that takes place. It solidifies everything, so growth no longer occurs. Didn't really talk about bone destruction. Specifically, you'll need to go into a little more detail. That I've already been going for about 16 minutes. I want to keep it short and sweet. But that gives you an outline of the information that you'll find in your book on pages like 128 through 132. That should give you a little bit of an idea of what I'm looking for. You may want to also talk about the bone's role in calcium homeostasis. Just say a couple things about that. And that should be helpful. So hey, good luck on the test. The test will be Thursday. Today's Tuesday, so we'll see you in class.